Good morning.
This is Elyzabeth Gaumer. Is that a correct pronunciation?
Gaumer.
Gaumer, okay. Assistant Commissioner for Research and Evaluation from HPD. Again, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you to Chairman Roberts and the members of the Rank Guidelines Board. I am Elyzabeth Gaumer, Assistant Commissioner for Research and Evaluation at HPD, and I'm also the Principal Investigator and Sponsor for the Housing and Vacancy Survey. So if there are additional questions on that after my testimony, I'm happy to do my best to answer those or follow up in conjunction with Danielle. I'd like to begin with an update on Housing New York, or HNY, Mayor de Blasio's ambitious housing plan that HPD is charged with leading. As you know, this administration has committed an unprecedented amount of resources to build or preserve affordable housing. HPD expanded the commitment to affordable housing production and preservation with the announcement of HNY 2.0, which laid a roadmap to expand HNY plan to create 300,000 units of affordable housing by 2026. This announcement was coupled with the dedication of $13.5 billion in mayoral capital to be spent towards affordable housing production and preservation through 2026. The administration has financed the construction of 28,492 units and the preservation of 59,065 units toward our HNY goals. Last calendar year, HPD financed more than 24,500 affordable homes, and about 50% of that housing serves households that earn under $43,000 a year for a family of three. The construction and preservation of affordable housing is critical to our mission, but it is not our sole focus. HPD utilizes a variety of tools to ensure that New Yorkers have access to affordable, quality housing, including protection against harassment, eviction, and displacement. Since 2014, the administration has provided funding for legal services and legislation to guarantee legal counsel for 180,000 New Yorkers, low-income tenants facing eviction. We have also taken part in a multi-agency anti-harassment task force with our state colleagues. We have worked to expand SCREE and DREE programs to freeze rent for eligible seniors and New Yorkers with disabilities. And we've also worked with the City Council to expand a certificate of no harassment policy to prevent displacement in areas most at risk by requiring a review of a building's recent history upon application for a material alteration, and a speculation watch list, which is a data-driven approach to help protect residents from the threat of investments in rent-regulated buildings that could be an indicator that they will be asked to leave to make way for higher-paying tenants. Many of our programs focus on identifying and improving our city's distressed housing stock, which has long been a priority of HPD. These efforts ensure that poor building conditions are addressed and prevents units from falling into disrepair, disinvestment, and abandonment. Our Alternative Enforcement Program, or AEP, celebrated its 10th year anniversary in 2017. Over this time, it has helped significantly improve conditions in more than 26,000 city homes and counting. In each round, an annual round, AEP identifies 250 of the most distressed multiple dwellings citywide. AEP Round 11 was released on January 31st, 2018, and from Round 10, so the previous year's round, 96 buildings remain in AEP, and 154 are now in compliance and no longer on the list. Third-Party Transfer, or TPT, enables HPD to step in to protect residents of the most troubled buildings, a necessary tool to improve fiscal and often physical distress to improve the living standards of those in the building while preserving long-term affordability. It is an integral part of the city's affordable housing strategy. Since the program's inception, 530 buildings have been transferred and $535 million in back taxes have been collected. Round 10 is our current round. It is in progress. No buildings have been transferred yet. It includes 139 buildings comprising 2,132 units. HPD also works to enforce the Housing Maintenance Code and ensure the quality of the stock through our code enforcement efforts. As part of these efforts, HPD aggressively responds to heat complaints and violations. Our enforcement numbers show this. In heat season for fiscal year 17, that's from October of 16 through December of 16, HPD received 85,000 complaints and issued 1,500 violations. In heat season for fiscal year 18, that's October 2017 through December of 17, HPD received 88,000 complaints and issued 1,700 violations. This is only a small sampling of the work that HPD has accomplished this year. The administration will continue to advance these efforts and all of HPD's work to address the housing needs of local residents and accomplish our mission to promote the quality and affordability of the city's housing stock and the strength and diversity of its many neighborhoods. The Rent Guidelines Board is an important partner in these efforts, and we thank you for your work protecting the nearly 1 million rent-stabilized units throughout our city. I would now like to shift my testimony and share some preliminary findings from the 2017 Housing and Vacancy Survey. Some of these have been incorporated into what you've already heard earlier today and in the rest of these hearings. These are meant to be very high-level findings, and I'm happy to work with all of you to do follow-up analyses as appropriate. The Housing and Vacancy Survey is used to determine, among other things, the net rental vacancy rate, the supply of housing, its condition and affordability, and the need for continuing rent regulation. It is also the sole source of information on the demographics of rent-stabilized and rent-controlled tenants. Its methodology has remained consistent over time, with only minor changes to improve its validity over time. It is conducted by the United States Census Bureau at the request of the City of New York. Interviews for the current survey were conducted between January and June of 2017, making it the most up-to-date representative data on New York City currently available. Today, I will share key statistics in the current state of housing, as well as provide high-level statistics on the rent-stabilized stock overall and the tenant population living in rent-stabilized units. I'd like to share with you just these few highlights today. Here is what we see as the key findings for 2017. New York City continues to add to the overall housing inventory, but we also continue to see a net loss of the lowest cost units. We continue to face a housing shortage with a 3.63 vacancy rate, but the shortage is most acute among those lower cost units, and therefore for the lowest earning New Yorkers. We continue to face a severe affordability crisis, with the majority of New Yorkers, regardless of income, paying a larger share of income toward rent than is sustainable. And among the rent-stabilized stock, we saw no net change in the overall supply of stabilized units since 2014. That was our last HVS. Housing conditions continue to improve, with the lowest prevalence of severe maintenance deficiencies in more than 2 decades. Rent-stabilized rents increased at a lower rate than the overall stock, in no small part due to the work of this board. And of course, the data continue to show that the vast majority of stabilized units serve tenants that are low income. Rent-stabilized tenants are more likely to be minorities, seniors, receive some form of public assistance, and have lived in their homes twice as long as market renters. The HVS estimated that the total number of residential units was more than 3.47 million citywide in 2017. That's the largest housing stock since the first survey was conducted in 1965. The low vacancy rate, despite the record-breaking housing stock numbers, indicates that although supply has continued to increase, it has failed to keep pace with the continuing demand for housing. Despite this overall increase in the size of the housing stock, we saw a large net loss of the lowest cost units as rents generally shifted upwards. This graph shows the total number of rental units by rent level as measured by both the 2014 and 2017 HVSs. The bars on the left show the number of units renting for less than $1,500 in 2014 and 17. This is in real terms. Please, go ahead.
Just curious, why is 1,500 your break point between the two categories?
It's a rounded version of the median rent currently.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. That actually speaks a little bit to your earlier question about vacancy rate, and the number is that about half of a rental stock is under 1,500. The bars on the right are then those units in 14 and 17 that are renting for or above $1,500 a month. And as you can see over this period, there was a net decrease of the lower cost units and a corresponding net increase of the higher cost units. Across the entire rental inventory, rents increased by 6.2% in real terms between 14 and 17. Rent-stabilized tenants benefited from lower rent increases, 2.6% over the same period. There was a substantial variation in the changes in housing costs by neighborhood, as you can hopefully see in that map, with the darker red indicating higher. Oh, I think the coffee is in the way of the legend. Nope, other one. You guys get it. The darker red is higher rates of rent increases. Okay. In 17, the median contract rent was $1,337, and the median gross rent, which is what most of these metrics that I'm showing you today focus on, which includes utility costs, so it's an overall measure of housing costs, was $1,450 in 2017. So a household would have to earn $58,000 in order to afford the typical New York City rental apartment in 2017. However, the HVS, which also measures many of the same things as the ACS, shows that the median household income for renters was $47,200.
So these are nominal rents. The 2014 versus 2017, those are nominal rents?
Those are, I believe, adjusted rents. I can't read my own footnote.
Yeah, if you look at footnote C, it's April 2017.
Yeah, it's adjusted dollars.
Thank you.
We can also provide nominal if you want. So that percent change is a reflection of the real change once we adjust for inflation. So these are, I think, the same numbers that Danielle presented earlier. The 2017 HVS reports the overall vacancy rate in rental apartments to be 3.63%. That's significantly below the 5% net rental vacancy rate threshold set forth in state and local laws as the condition determining that a housing emergency continues to exist. But it is important to note that the housing shortage is not equal. It is, of course, much more acute among the lower cost units. As the figure shows, the net rental vacancy rate varies by rent level, almost linearly. The vacancy rate is 1.2% at the lowest levels, and at the highest rent levels, it is well above our 5% emergency threshold. Units with asking rents of $2,000 to $2,499 have a 5.2% vacancy rate, and those with asking rents at or above $2,500 have an 8.7% vacancy rate. What all of these factors continue to fuel is this affordability crisis that we have, of course, seen unabated for the last many years. In 2017, 56% of all renter-occupied households were rent-burdened or paying more than 30% of their monthly gross income toward housing costs. 32% were severely burdened or paying more than half of their income toward housing. As one might expect, the burden is not evenly distributed across all income groups. When we look at the distribution of renter-occupied households by HUD income limits, which is what's shown here in this graph, we see that, of course, the lowest income households have much higher prevalence of rent burden. This, of course, is how we classify households to qualify for affordable housing by HUD income limit groups. And the disproportionate burden is really concentrated all the way up, certainly through the very low income as well as low income households. This figure rolls up those same data into broader categories, and this enables us to see different facets of this affordability crisis. So in the first bar, which includes households that are extremely low income, those are typically at or close to the federal poverty line, we see that about half of households, or just over 360,000 households, are burdened. Of those who are rent burdened in this income stratum, almost all are severely burdened. The remaining 50%, of the stack bar, that's what's shown in the gray, are largely served by subsidized housing or otherwise receiving some form of rental assistance. And that's how they're able to live in units that are affordable to them. In the second bar, these are households designated as very low or low income. A larger share are rent burdened. Here, about 60% are paying more than 30% of income toward housing costs each month. That's equivalent to about 425,000 households. Of those, 165,000 are severely burdened or paying more than half of income toward housing. Again, the remainder in the gray bar is either receiving some form of housing assistance or living in lower cost units in the private market. So I can share with you a detailed graph, but essentially we're talking about up to about 50,000 a year in the first two bars, depending on household size. Rent-stabilized and rent-controlled units are, of course, an important source of this low-cost housing and are critical for maintaining this precious component of the stock. The median gross rent for rent-stabilized units was $1,375 and $1,039 for rent-controlled units, respectively. In addition to the lower rents, rent-stabilized rents did not increase as rapidly as the overall stock. As I said before, the overall increase for rent-stabilized units was 2.6%, compared to 6.2% for the overall stock. In 2017, the HVS estimated that there were 966,000 rent-stabilized units, equivalent to about 44% of the entire stock. In comparison, there were an estimated 848,000 private non-regulated units, or just under 39% of the rental stock. As the map shows, rent-stabilized units are located throughout the 5 boroughs, but are concentrated in the Bronx and Manhattan, as well as parts of Brooklyn and some of Queens. The areas where we see the fewest number of rent-stabilized units are parts of the city where we know that home ownership rates are much higher. In order to provide a picture of the current rent-stabilized stock and tenant population, I would like to share some high-level findings that compare stabilized units to private non-regulated units, those that are frequently called market units. So please note that what I'm about to show is only a subset of the overall stock, not estimates of the citywide citywide rental housing. The HVS measures housing conditions in several ways, including through self-report of the current occupants regarding maintenance deficiencies. One important measure of housing quality is the count of items that were reported, with 5 or more deficiencies representing a unit with critical deficits. In 2017, 3.6% of the renter-occupied units overall reported 5 or more deficiencies, and this is the lowest prevalence on record since 1991 when the HVS began measuring these items. This graph here shows the prevalence of units with 5 or more maintenance deficiencies for private unregulated units and for rent-stabilized units over time, with the green bars all the way on the right being the current estimates in 2017. Rent-stabilized units continue to exhibit a higher share of units with poor conditions. This is not surprising given the age of the stabilized stock. However, we see that conditions have improved over time, similarly in every type of housing, and they are currently the best that they've been in over 20 years. Here we see the income distribution of rent-stabilized tenants. 63% are low income, that is earning up to 80% of HUD income limits. That's equal to about 610,000 households. And an additional 23% are moderate or middle income. Compared to private, non-regulated households, fewer rent-stabilized households are headed by white non-Hispanics. Rent-stabilized units are also more likely to have at least one senior living in their home. In 2017, private non-regulated units typically rented for more than rent-stabilized units. The median monthly gross rent for private non-regulated units was $1,830, as opposed to $1,375 for rent-stabilized units. A higher proportion of rent-stabilized tenants are rent-burdened, as well as severely rent-burdened compared to market tenants. 59% of rent-stabilized tenants are currently rent-burdened, and 35% are severely burdened. This is compared to 52% and 29%, respectively, for private non-regulated tenants. The median household income of rent-stabilized tenants is lower than that of private non-regulated renters, and more rent-stabilized tenants are considered low income as defined by HUD income limits. Rent-stabilized tenants are also much more likely to receive cash assistance in the form of TANF, SNAP, or WIC. The 2017
just out of curiosity.
Sure.
So if they do receive assistance, does that get represented in the 44,560?
It does not. We can calculate that independently, but it is not counted as cash income the way that this is particularly measured. This is wages, combination of wages, retirement benefits, essentially cash that the household controls.
Got it. So could we get the information on additional?
Sure, on the
assistance?
amount?
Yeah.
Sure, we can calculate that for you.
Do you have a ballpark number as to what that would amount would be? No?
I've only had the data for about a month, so I haven't gone through everything. I cannot estimate a guess.
Thank you.
As opposed to where it's designated for specific expenditure purposes.
And that's based on like what they need.
Correct. Overall, in summary, we saw that the 2017 HVS shows that there continues to be a severe affordability crisis. Half of all renters are rent burdened, 1/3 are severely burdened, and that's a higher prevalence in the rent-stabilized tenant population. Median rents are not affordable to the typical New York household. Rent-stabilized rents rose less sharply and represent a large and generally lower-cost portion of our stock. As this board knows, the majority of rent-stabilized tenants are low income, and the overall tenant population in stabilized units is more vulnerable than those living in the private, non-regulated market across a number of measures. Taking all of these first findings into consideration, we find that New York City continues its state of housing emergency. Of course, the local laws have been extended. The shortage is particularly acute for lower-income households who face the lowest vacancy rates and a shrinking stock of lower-cost units. It is clear from the 2017 HVS that we must not only continue to add to the overall stock to address our emergency, but specifically add lower-cost units and work to retain existing units with lower rents in order to support everyday New Yorkers who face continued affordability challenges. Thank you for the opportunity to share 2017 HVS findings and speak with you about HPD's work. We look forward to further collaboration with the Rent Guidelines Board, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Hi. Thank you. Do you have a sense how the rent burden rate has changed over years?
I'm sorry, could
Do
you
you have data on the rent burden shifting over years? Is that something you?
Sure, we have that longitudinally. We measure this every 3 years when the Housing and Vacancy Survey is fielded, and we certainly have those data at different time points, so we can provide that over time. I can say that it has not changed in any statistically meaningful way between 14 and 17. It's almost exactly the same. And that's, of course, distressing given that pretty historic investments and expansion of the affordable housing stock that it hasn't actually shifted rent burden.
I have a question about the new units created, the 300,000 units that the cities are planning by 2026. How many of those are addressing what we're seeing in the charts? Like, how many of them are for the folks that are making under $50,000 a year? And what have you currently done to address that? And are most of them rent regulated and things that we should be taking into account as we make our decision?
So I'm happy to send a sheet with the full metrics for our HNY production and goals that gives you the full breakdown by income bands as well as rental and homeownership. I'm happy to send that as soon as I get back to my office for you. On all of our rental production as well as preservation, the vast majority becomes rent stabilized if it is not already rent stabilized through our regulatory agreements. So in other words, the additions through affordable housing production and to a lesser extent preservation are actively adding to the rent stabilized stock.
This is more of maybe of a comment or kind of just a big thought question, but in terms of the two presentations we heard today, we didn't really think about we didn't talk about the change in the population, that the city is growing pretty dramatically, and that partially drives, you have increased production of housing units, but you have increased population, and that kind of nets out. Do you do any population adjusted analyses, or do you ever look at like how long someone has been a resident and whether they're living in rent stabilized housing? Like, do we have a sense of, this is a negative way of saying it, but do new residents of the city displace people who have been long-term residents of the city? Do we ever look at a question like that?
There's a lot of questions implicit in those big questions. So let me take it in a couple of parts. So yes, the HVS does many things. It is obviously first and foremost a housing survey, but we do collect a range of information about the population on the residents. So we do have population numbers that we use, and that although we're still in the early phases of 2017, if there's specific things about population that you'd like to see, we can certainly do our best to pull those. In terms of the length of residence, and as well as turnover, the other side of that, we do a fair amount of analysis on those issues, and particularly within the rent-stabilized stock. That's obviously a key lever for rent increases, and so we look at that quite closely, using HVS data among other sources. As far as displacement goes, displacement is a challenging issue to measure using any data or in any city, including New York, how we define it, what it means, how we measure it, how we track it. So it's a very difficult set of research questions. I can say more broadly that because rent stabilization is not only a price control system, but also, of course, conveys tenant rents, including the right to lease renewal, we do see, and that it's obviously a lower set of rent increases over time, as we see here. This is the median length of residence. Here is 8 years compared to 4 for market units. There's a lot of factors that go into that, of course. There's demographic differences, which are correlated very strongly with length of residence, et cetera. So we know that displacement is a really critical issue, but displacement of currently stabilized tenants is less of a concern in that they have a right to lease renewal. That does not mitigate, of course, real threats from harassment and legal forms of rent increases that may make it such that a tenant can no longer afford to stay in a stabilized unit and gives it up voluntarily. So we know that displacement is a big concern. I cannot tell you whether it's new residents displacing as opposed to different current New Yorkers moving into those units, but we do see a fair amount of churn in neighborhoods that have upward market pressures.
Is the population growth, isn't that captured in the census?
Yes, so population growth is measured through a number of census products. This is actually a census
Right.
As well. So there are 3 main sets of data that housing researchers use here in New York. One is, of course, the decennial census, which is the full enumerated count that only happens once every 10 years. There is then the American Community Survey, which Danielle had presented some data from earlier. That's a national survey, but gathers a very large amount of demographic information here in our city that also has population counts. Many of the data estimates that come out of the ACS use a combination of years put together. So while it is very good for understanding overall patterns, it's less precise for measuring things like household incomes or rents or changes in those things, because you in fact have essentially a rolling average over time that flattens out some of those trends. And the third census data that we use quite extensively, obviously, is our own census product, which is the Housing and Vacancy Survey, which is point in time for a given year. So in the year and a little bit around that, it's very accurate. In addition, the HVS is the only census survey that actually identifies rent stabilized and rent controlled tenants, which makes it, for certainly this board's purposes, very, very critical. So yes, there are many ways that you can get population estimates for New York City from different sources and different time points, but the HVS, at least right now, is the most up-to-date information and the only source where you can split it out by different types of housing stock.
And do you know how much the population has increased from 14 to 17? Do we know that number?
I don't have that off the top of my head, but I'm happy to send that as a follow-up.
Thank you.
Just a question on, like, we talked a lot about, like, asking rents from the previous presentation and what people actually pay. Do you guys do any analysis with, like, the actual legal rent from what is reported to DHCR and what the rents could be as a measure to see, you know, if rents are actually a lot lower than what tenants are paying and what you could be asking in the market?
Yep, that's a really important question, and it's a really important point to make that goes around all of these analyses we've been looking at today. The HVS and the ACS both collect contract rent, meaning whatever the tenant is paying, as well as then a gross rent, which is the contract rent with an adjustment for utility factor. Of course, rent-stabilized rents have at least 2 rent levels that are possible. In some cases, there are actually more rent levels that could be on record for that unit. There's the legal rent, of course, which is the maximum allowable increases. That is not always what a tenant pays as a contract rent. So these estimates that we've been talking about today reflect that contract rent, which, for example, could be a preferential rent or a legal rent, depending on the situation of a tenant. Or I should say also an actual rent in the cases where a tenant has an abatement of some form as a result of a stipulation, or if a major capital improvement is capped and is being phased in at 6%, it would be an actual rent that differs from, in fact, even the contract rent. So the HVS and ACS both collect really just what that tenant is experiencing at this moment in time. It is very important to note that that is not the same thing as what the legal rent necessarily is that is attached to that unit, or as a result, what that rent could increase to in the case of a preferential rent. So we do not currently, we have not in the past combined legal rent information in the housing and vacancy survey. However, it is something that we are hoping to do with these 17 data. It takes a little bit of time to do that kind of data matching, but we are actively working with our partners at the state and the Census Bureau to be able to incorporate that and look at some of that in our upcoming analysis.
So Liz, so contract rent is in the HVS is what the tenant is paying, or what?
Correct.
So it's what the tenant is paying is the
Correct.
contract rent. in the
So it
HVS.
would be an actual or a preferential, or in the case where there are neither of those, then a legal
But it's
rent.
not necessarily what the lease says.
Correct.
So it's best to describe as the actual rent that tenant is paying.
Correct.
Which is maybe different than the contract or the legal.
Right.
So it's
That is
more-
absolutely
More
right.
accurately an actual rent.
An actual rent.
Okay.
Andrew, so you would define, how would we define what are our various rents in terms of our board reports? So actual rent we have, and then we have a number for, the legal rent would be the preferential rent, is that?
No, legal rent is what the owner can legally charge in a rent stabilized. The high, yeah.
Okay.
The contract rent is what's on the lease, what the tenant is responsible for
This
each month.
particular lease payment.
Right.
Yeah.
Which can be equal to the legal rent. Or the contract rent can be lower. And the actual rent is what the tenant is actually paying of that contract amount.
Why would the actual be different than the contract?
Because it's a
So I can give you an example from my life, right, when I was a tenant. I, for example, had a rent abatement as a result of settling a court case where I was given, a couple of months of free rent rather than being paid outright by my landlord. And so that lowered my actual rent for a short period of time. I also, at one point, had MCIs that had been approved on my building, and I was a stabilized tenant, obviously. And as those MCIs were phased in, I didn't, of course, immediately pay the full MCI. It was phased in. So the legal rent incorporated all of the full MCI charges, but the phase-in was not actually what I paid on a monthly basis until that was fully phased in.
Another big category is Section 8 tenants. So Section 8, they're going to be paying an actual, what they pay is not what the contract rent, it's going to be less than the contract rent and certainly less than the legal rent. So there's an example of what that tenant is actually paying.
Do we know, like, how many tenants in rent-stabilized units have Section 8? Like, is there any way of, like, pulling that out so that
Yeah.
when we have this conversation, we actually have it with, like, people who are paying the full amount
So
of what's
we
contracted?
measure that in the HVS. I don't have that estimate with me, but we could certainly pull that of what the prevalence of Section 8 is within the rent stabilized stock.
Andrew, do we generally adjust for that in our numbers? Or, I mean, I know some of our numbers adjust for Section 8, but do...
Yeah, the
across
only
board,
one,
do we do that
the only one number that we tend to adjust is the rent, the income to
Cost
rent
income ratio.
ratio, when you include the Section 8 tenants there, they're always,
It bumps up the ratio.
it bumps it up because it's indicating they're paying 100%.
Right, I'll say
income.
these graphs, we take out those receiving Section 8.
Oh, you do?
And they're in the gray, we represent them in the gray,
Okay.
as well as public housing.
And do we know what percentage of to Shayla's question, what percentage of the rent-stabilized universe is Section 8? Do we have an idea about that? Is it?
I'm happy to follow up
Get
with
to
that.
number.
It is,
certainly.
oh.
Well,
less than 10%.
Yeah.
80,000 off the lot.
Here.
1,000 off of 966.
We've issued a number of memos in the past where we provide those adjustments historically, and from my recollection, it's 80-something thousand, maybe 85,000, which is a little less than 10% of the stock, and it bumps the rent-to-income ratio down a couple of percentage points. We can't do that yet because we don't have the raw data, but you probably have a copy of that memo from last year, or we can reissue that memo so that everybody can see the most recent data, which is from 2014, but as of now is the most recent data.
Thank you.
Do we have that, like, would that also include like the housing allowances from HRA? So those numbers in gray would include all of that?
As much as we measure it in the HVS, we do not collect every form of assistance in the interview. And so it's, in general, I would say that it is an underreport of the population that receives some form of assistance. But the numbers are all across the board, do not make up a very substantial portion of the rent-stabilized stock.
I just want to make sure that I understand the comment about net change and overall supply of stabilized housing. Your finding is that there has been no net change in stabilized stock.
Correct. Here, I can direct you to this appendix slide. I should note, each time we do an HVS, we make every attempt to update our methodology and our data sources to make it the most robust, accurate, et cetera, that we can. We did that in 17. We again updated and incorporated new sources of information in how we estimate whether a unit is subject to rent stabilization. So that's all the way on the right, our blue bar, that's our estimate from the 2017 HVS of the rent stabilized units, 966,442. In 2014, in the middle there, we had originally used a slightly different methodology, which put the estimates at over 1 million units. When we apply our updated and improved methodology, 2014 would have shown that we had about 946,000 rent-stabilized units. So you can compare all of those blue bars to one another or the orange bars to one another. The blue bars are our current and much more improved methodology. So when I say that there is no difference, there's a slight increase, but in the sense that this is a survey and everything has a margin of error around it, that is not a statistically meaningful increase. So we're considering it flat.
But you also report a net loss in the lowest cost units. What can you tell us more about that?
Sure. So what those two things together suggest to us and to me is that rents overall have increased. The stabilized stock has remained essentially at the same numbers. That is net, so it does include, there are obviously exits from rent stabilization and additions. So, but from 2 time points, we're at about the same C level. But the rent levels of those rent stabilized units now are higher, and the distribution has shifted upwards relative to where we were in 14.
So they're not.
So there's the same number of rent-stabilized units, but the overall rents for them are higher than they were in 14. And therefore, what had been a rent stabilized or other form of housing in 14 that was renting for, say, $1,000, its rent has increased, and there are just fewer units renting for those low rents.
So the net, it's not a loss to the stabilized stock, it's just simply a loss to that category. It goes up to the next grouping because the rents are going up. So it's not a loss from the stock, it's just shifted because the rents have gone up. So what remains in that lower category becomes a smaller number.
The highlight for me is that during that period of time, we also had historic lows. And so we're still seeing rent levels still continue to increase, even though we've had zeros and historic lows in the
Right.
last few years. So to me, it's an interesting thing to look at while, all the data we're seeing today.
Well, what's being reported is a 2%, and I think this is inflation-adjusted increase for all rent-stabilized units over a 3-year period.
It's less than 80
Yeah.
basis points a year.
That's correct. But what it means, when you couple it with this graph here, what that signifies is that we did have many more units renting for very low rents that are no longer renting for those low rents. We have many more units that are right in the middle of that distribution, renting for something at or very close to the median rent of $1,450. And then there's, of course, the corresponding increase in higher cost units. So it's really about what the rents have been. The overall stabilized stock was relatively steady, but some units exited that were the lowest cost. Others have been added in that are more middle-level rents, including some affordable housing that has become stabilized. And the overall pattern is that we just have fewer units that are renting for those lowest rents.
Do we have data on the rate of increase in lower-priced units?
We can do our best to estimate how many relatively recently constructed units have come in at those lowest rents. We don't yet have a longitudinal HVS that actually allows us to track specific units over time. We won't have that, unfortunately, for probably another year or so. We'll be able to report on that next year. But we can take a look and see if there are some things that we could pull out that at least are suggestive of that. There are, of course, low-cost units that have been added through HPD's efforts, but many fewer, unfortunately, than what from the stock, the already existing stock, that are no longer renting for those low rents.
So you just said you had a longitudinal group? So are you asking the same group of renters over?
Yeah, so the HVS is very unique and a really powerful data tool. So at the beginning of a decade, the Census Bureau pulls a representative sample of units across the city. That is what we call our core sample. So we interview those just after the new decade begins. That's our first HVS. In this decade, that was our 2011 survey. When we're ready, then 3 years later, we augment that sample with anything that's newly constructed, or of course any units that have been demolished or converted or altered in some substantial way. So there's a small change, but we then seek to re-interview the same units we did in 11, as well as then an additional subsample of new units that didn't exist in the previous wave. And then 3 years later, we do that process again. So the longitudinal file essentially takes all of the units that we've had multiple interviews for and allows us to actually join them over time so that we can look at changes within a given residential unit.
So that you can basically do 3 HVSs at a time.
Any other questions? David? Oh. Thank you very much. Appreciate your
welcome.
testimony.
And I'll follow up through Andrew with some of these items that we've already identified.
That would be terrific. Thanks very much.
Of course.
Last year, we didn't have a presentation, like HPD did a totally different kind of presentation last year.
The HVS is new, yeah.
This is new, yeah.
New information last year, so they just gave us the big picture.
Yeah, I mean, we're fortunate every 3 years to have this wonderful data source that we don't get every year, which is, So the importance of presenting that, I mean, it's,
Can we turn
It's
off
critical.
the light? Thank you. Good job. All right. New job description, technical assistant. Yeah.
Get extra.
Good. So, additional board discussion. I think we have one outstanding item on schedule. Not to put you on the spot, Scott, but did you find out whether you're available on the 18th?
Of which day? Of which month?
This is June
there's
18th.
the schedule's in your folder. So on the back there, we have the hearing dates. There was a proposal to change the one from the 21st initially to the 20th, and that didn't work out. But, so we're asking about the 18th. It would be in the same location, same time.
Let me get back to you.
Okay.
I locked all these in, and then I have to see if I could change something.
If the sooner, we'd like to post this, so if you can get back to me like later today or tomorrow, is that?
And that's the only option?
Yeah, because we already explored one of the options which you couldn't do. So we're now exploring option number 2.
Okay.
I think, I don't know if there is another option. That's a good question. Probably not, unless we moved it to way up earlier in the schedule. That would be the only other option, right? And I don't know how that fits with the statutory time between
Yeah, that's the problem. The
preliminary
7th
vote and the public hearing.
Yeah, the 7th is about the earliest that we can do it,
Okay.
because we need 30 days between the time the guidelines are published in the city record.
So I think that really, that,
Unless there's some sort of, the other would be to put another hearing in that following week, but that'd be,
then we'd be having 3
and
hearings in
that's
a
a
week,
lot.
which I think is cruel and unusual punishment. Okay, other items for discussion? Questions for staff? I hear
movie.
no questions, no observations. Therefore, do I hear a motion to adjourn? I think that was, I don't know if that was a motion or a second, but we're adjourned. Whichever it wasn't is done. Okay, we're adjourned. Thank you.